Welcome to today's IBT ABC UTC Quarterly Research Seminar. The presentations in this seminar highlight research work at the IBT ABC UTC Partners University. Each seminar consists of a 40-minute presentation followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. My name is Frei Pozo, and I'm a research assistant professor at the IBT ABC UTC. I will be moderating today's research seminar. I'm assisted by Bijan Kalegi, co-director of implementation at IBT ABC UTC, and Paul Lies, the former Georgia State bridge engineer. Bijan and Paul will be moderating the Q&A session. We are pleased to welcome participants at approximately 500 registered sites for today's seminar. Our featured research project today is on the use of UHPC in bridge columns, presented by our team at Florida International University. Our next monthly webinar will be held on August 28, 2025, from 1 to 2 p.m. to 15 p.m. Eastern Time. We are honored to be joined by Dr. Frank Russo, who is the president at Russo Structural Services. He will be followed by Vin Bartuka, bridge steel specialist at the National State Bridge Alliance, American Institute of Steel Construction, both of whom will introduce practical solutions and model guidance to help designers and contractors streamline steel highway bridge projects, blending proven engineering practices with constructability-focused solutions. Please mark your calendar for August 28. As you may know, each year, our advisory committee suggests a topic for in-depth web training. This year, in-depth web training will be held on Tuesday, September 9, 2025, from 11 to 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Our topic will be Simple for Dead, Continuous for Life, Load, Steel Bridge System, Case Studies, Design, Fabrication, History, presented by Brian Hartnagel, Ross Barron, Dr. Atrod Asesinamini, Jason Kennitz, and Gary Wish. Before I introduce our presenters, I will review some housekeeping items. Many of you may know these seminars are recorded and posted on the IBT ABC UTC website in the section titled Research Seminar Archives, so you can access this and all previous seminars for future learning and to share with interested colleagues. I would like to point out that a PDF version of today's presentation is provided in the Go-To dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. You can download these PDFs during the training session. They will also be posted in the archives. Lastly, this presentation will be followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions and answers. Please enter any questions you have in the question box in the Go-To dashboard. The seminar today features the IBT ABC UTC research project on use of ultra-high performance concrete in bridge columns. That was conducted here at Florida International University. We are pleased to introduce our presenters, Fateme Ali Akbari, a PhD student here at Florida International University, FIU, and Dr. Kingsley Law, Associate Professor here at Florida International University as well.
Hello everyone, today we are excited to present our research works at FIU on behavior of reinforced ultra-high performance concrete column and durability considerations. We conducted 3 separate projects at FIU to evaluate the performance of ultra-high performance concrete in different structural applications. The first project focuses on the structural behavior of full UHPC columns. And the second project investigates the use of UHPC as a retrofit material for deficient concrete columns. And third project explored the durability performance of UHPC. Ultra-high performance concrete is an innovative cement-based composite material with exceptional properties including ultra-high compressive strength, high durability, and the capability for macro crack self-healing, while can significantly prolong service life. Not just in the case of extreme loading, with time due to environmental factors, materials deteriorate and so do structures. Both seismic and non-seismic structures subjected to deterioration were found to have less collapse resistance. This can be associated with material deterioration, which result in decreasing ductility and strength. Columns are the main elements for the stability of structures, and several approaches have been proposed in literature to improve the performance of column under axial and lateral load. One of these approaches can be using innovative materials such as UHPC to improve their seismic, progressive collapse, and corrosion resistance. Overall, very limited research work was performed to investigate the performance of full UHPC columns under axial and lateral loading. So FIU research work aims to investigate the structural behavior of UHPC columns reinforced with conventional rebars. The volume ratio of steel fiber is the primary variable investigated in this research work. All column specimens have 60 inches high and reinforced with conventional rebars. For longitudinal reinforcement, we used 8 rebars, and you can see the cross-section of all UHPC columns in this figure. All specimens had same geometry and reinforcement details. This table shows the material properties and volume ratio of a steel fiber and ratio of applied axial load to the capacity of columns. To have the material properties, we tested UHPC sample on rebars in our material lab. And these figures show construction process. First, the reinforcement case of foundation were placed inside the footing formwork, and all longitudinal rebars of column were positioned inside the footing. The outer part of a foundation were then cast with normal strength concrete. It should be noted that UHPC footing were considered for all specimens to better understand the behavior of a plastic hinge. Only the representative part of foundation below the column was cast with UHPC, and normal strength concrete was used for the rest of it. Here you can see the test setup which we used to apply axial and cyclic lateral loading. Hydraulic actuator applied cyclic load. The displacement control method, which was implemented as incremental drift ratio, governs the cyclic loading. And using a beam and hydraulic jack, a pure axial force equal to 20% of column's capacity were applied to the top of the column. Here you can see the crack propagation of our first specimen, which had 2% steel fiber. Fracture cracks appear near the base of column at early loading stage. Cracks were Cracks were concentrated at the bottom, aligning with the area of maximum bending moment and shear. As the load increased, flexural and shear cracks extended upward. This figure shows the final stage of loading, which means column experienced about 7-inch lateral displacement. We tested another specimen with 2% steel fiber, and same damage mode was observed. Horizontal and diagonal cracks form under combined bending and shear forces intersecting with the flexural cracks. The steel fiber delay crack propagation and prevent rapid deterioration. Here you can see the crack propagation of third specimen, which had 0.5% steel fiber. Horizontal and diagonal cracks were more prominent compared to the specimen with 2% steel fiber. Wider cracks and less effective control of crack propagation was observed. Spalling of concrete become evident, especially near the compressive zone. You can see the final deformed shape of column at 7-inch lateral displacement, localized crushing, and widening of crack occurred. Here you can see the crack modes for a specimen without steel fiber. Cracks propagate rapidly with the, actually with horizontal and diagonal cracks forming early and widening significantly. Severe spalling, extensive crushing of concrete occurred and leading to rapid loss of load-bearing capacity. We had to stop the test at 5-inch lateral displacement. Cover crushing occurred at early stage of loading. The absence of steel fiber result in poor energy dissipation and brittle behavior. This slide shows the damage mode observed in the last specimen, which had 1% steel fiber content. As seen in the image, the specimen exhibit multiple fractural cracks compared to non-fiber specimen. The presence of steel fiber help in bridging cracks, delaying the onset of major crushing and subsequently rebar buckling. The historetic response of specimens demonstrate the impact of steel fiber content on ductility, energy dissipation, and overall structural performance. A specimen with 2% steel fiber exhibit stable hysteretic loops. The steel fiber contributed significantly to crack control, delaying stiffness degradation and enhancing load carrying capacity. A specimen without steel fiber showed poor energy dissipation capacity and rapid stiffness degradation. The absence of steel fiber results in brittle behavior with significant strength degradation. This figure shows the hysteretic response of UHPC column with 1 and 2% steel fiber content. The 1% fiber specimen still shows improved performance compared to fiberless UHPC column. The experimental result of reinforced UHPC columns showed significant difference in the structural behavior of these elements based on the volume ratio of steel fiber than other specimens. The column without steel fiber exhibit poor performance with spalling initiation during the first cycle of lateral loading and propagating toward the upper region of the column. In contrast, column with a steel fiber demonstrate improved performance under similar loading conditions. These observations indicate that UHPC column with a lower volume ratio of steel fiber and without a steel fiber are unsuitable for application in seismic and non-seismic regions due to their structural resilience. UHPC is characterized by its exceptional mechanical properties, including high compressive strength and low permeability. However, its brittleness remains a significant concern, especially under cyclic and axial loading. Steel fiber are commonly incorporated into UHPC to mitigate this brittleness and enhance the structural performance. Now, let's move on to a very common and critical scenario where the structure already exists, but due to long-term environmental exposure, such as corrosion or extreme loading events, certain and critical elements like column need strengthening. This is not a rare situation. In fact, it's something engineers often face in real-world practice. That's why regular inspection of existing structure is essential based on the condition and level of deterioration. Choosing an appropriate and optimized retrofit method is crucial. Neglecting this need for inspection and retrofit can have a serious consequence. as we tragically saw in the collapse of Champlain Tower in Miami. In this context, our second project investigates how using UHPC jacket can offer an effective solution for retrofitting deficient columns. The experimental program involved 4 large-scale column specimens. One served as the control column, the other 3 were retrofitted columns. One using normal strength jacket, which is C10, C14, and 2 using UHPC jacket, C10, U14, 1 and 2. For all retrofitted columns, the jacket were 2 inches thick. One of the UHPC jacket column was tested under higher axial load to assess the influence of axial force on performance. The fabrication process was completed in several steps. First, the reinforcement cage for the footing were placed inside the footing formwork, and then all the longitudinal rebars of column, including those for the core and jacket, were positioned inside the footing. The footing were then cast with normal strength concrete. The next step, the stirrups of core were placed and the cores were cast. For the retrofit specimens, the surface of the core was roughened by sandblasting to improve bonding with jacket. The jackets were then cast, one with normal strength concrete and 2 with open source UHPC mix. This figure shows the test setup for experimental program, which is same as previous project. Each column was first subjected to a constant axial load. The cyclic lateral displacement were applied using actuator. Linear potentiometers were used to measure lateral displacement and curvatures along the plastic hinge region. Strain gauges were also attached to reinforcement rebars to capture local behavior. This slide shows the crack propagation of specimen C10, which was a control specimen. As shown, the crack distribution along the total length of column. The stirrups remain elastic during the cyclic loading. The failure occurred when the stirrups in the plastic hinge region opened from the hooks and the longitudinal reinforcement buckled. This figure shows crack pattern and failure mode of specimen C10, C14, which was retrofitted using normal strength concrete jacket. Compared to the control specimen C10, this specimen exhibit increased stiffness and strength. However, under cyclic loading, failure eventually occurred due to buckling of the longitudinal corner rebars within the jacket. Crushing was mostly limited to the jacket region, as you can see. This figure shows the failure mode of both retrofitted specimen using UHPC jacket. As can be seen, fracture cracks in both specimens developed within the height, but compared to the previous specimen, plasticity occurred over a shorter length. This demonstrates a actually a higher stress concentration in the specimen C10 U14-1, similar to a specimen with normal strength jacket. Failure occurred when the crushing of the concrete penetrated through the jacket, causing the longitudinal rebar to lose the UHPC as a lateral strength and subsequently buckled. Here we examine the moment curvature behavior. As expected, the UHPC retrofit columns show higher moment capacity, and the curvature capacity increased progressively from column C10 to C14 and U14. This figure shows the load displacement hysteresis curve of all specimens. The hysteresis curve for all specimens shows ductile fracture responses. In conclusion, the experimental data indicate that a reinforced UHPC shell served as an effective retrofit technique. The reinforced UHPC shell notably enhance the structural performance of retrofit specimen by increasing fracture capacity, stiffness, and energy absorption during cyclic loading, while preserving ductility compared to normal strength concrete jacket. The reinforced normal strength concrete jacket didn't significantly decrease the plastic hinge length. Conversely, the reinforced UHPC jacket significantly reduced the plastic hinge length, focusing plasticity within a shorter region. Despite this reduction in plastic hinge length, the plastic rotation capacity increased, enabling the UHPC jacketed members to maintain ductility effectively.
Thank you, Fatima. So you gave us a couple of case studies of interesting and novel uses for UHPC for bridge applications. So it seems like UHPC is becoming more and more important as a tool and a material for our construction. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the durability implications for UHPC and some corrosion considerations and how they may be implemented not only for new construction, but also for some of the retrofit cases that you described in the second case. So ideally, steel placed in concrete environments should be a very ideal situation. Steel in the high pH environment in the concrete pour water typically develops a passive film, really corrosion should not occur at all. But it's in extreme environments and aggressive environments where that passive film can be broken down. And most of the cases that we see, especially from marine bridges and marine columns as well, and other environments, it has to do with the presence of salts. So notably, chloride ions is notorious for being able to break down that passive film. So when you have these aggressive salt environments, whether it be from the seawater itself or just atmospheric spray near the coastlines, chlorides are able to penetrate through the concrete cover, through the concrete pour water, eventually diffused with enough concentration at the steel interface at a sufficient amount where it can start breaking down that passive film. So this cartoon on the right-hand side is drawn by Marcel Pourbet. It's a famous cartoon showing some of the thermodynamics associated with how corrosion can develop for steel in various environments, including high pH concrete pour water environments. So typically in high pH environments, the corrosion or the devil hair is being locked up in a cage, and we call that passivation. So we can manage the rate of corrosion that can occur and limit that rate to where it can extend to the service life that we expect for our bridges. Certain environments that it can break down the devil is prevalent where corrosion can occur, but the effect of aggressive environments like chlorides, it really is able to break that devil free from that cage essentially. So we'll talk about some of the material ramifications for chloride penetration, but we'll also spend some time focusing on an area in terms of carbonation-induced corrosion. So this has implications for marine bridges, for bridges that have long service lives, and it has implications as well for buildings as well, especially for older structures or concrete with lower quality concrete. And probably we'll talk about how UHPC can be used to mitigate some of these effects. So in terms of carbonation-induced corrosion, the major factor to break that devil free from that cage is actually the air that we breathe. So the carbon dioxide that is in the atmospheric air can penetrate through the concrete cover, typically through the concrete pour water dissolves via Henry's law, and comes in and interacts with the calcium hydroxide, the portlandite that we find in the concrete pour water. It consumes the calcium hydroxide, for example, consumes the hydroxyl ions, creating a calcium carbonate, the byproduct end. Sometimes we see some efflorescence related to that. But importantly, the consumption of the hydroxyl ions causes the reduction of pH. And going back to Marcel Pourbet's cartoon on the right-hand side, it gets to a point where the devil becomes more prominent as we shift from the higher pHs to lower pHs as the hydroxyl ions are consumed. And so we'll talk about some of the effects, how UHPC can be useful to mitigate some of these effects. So what are the major factors that can account that are related to carbonation-induced corrosion? Well, evidently it's material related, and in part also design. So the cement content you have, the concrete mix design, including UHPC, the concrete composition, are related in terms of how permeable the concrete may be to not only moisture, but also the gases, including for carbon dioxide and oxygen. Evidently, design is important, the cover depth. The larger the cover depth, then obviously the longer path it takes for moisture to penetrate or for gases, including CO2, to penetrate through the system. So larger cover depth can buy you a little more time. Relative humidity of the environment is also very important because it's associated with how much water and moisture can be present within the pore system of the concrete itself. So at higher humidities, you can develop more moisture within the system, and corrosion is an electrochemical process that requires an electrolyte, requires water. So evidently at higher moisture presence, you can promote these electrochemical reactions, the oxidation reduction reactions that causes the damage to the construction materials. Wet and dry cycling in terms of moisture is also very important and is somewhat related to the oxygen availability. So typically for infrastructure systems, what really causes corrosion in terms of the actual reactions that occur really is oxygen. Oxygen is the universal oxidizer. Oxygen is the reduction of oxygen typically is the reaction that counts for the oxidation of the steel and the iron, for example. So oxygen needs to be present in the system. Just as you can imagine, if you have goldfish, for example, in a fish bowl, sometimes we have to bubble the water to promote more oxygen being inside that water, for example. So oxygen has to be present in the water and electrolyte in the concrete for it to be present. So if you have a wet environment, there may not be high level oxygen. So even though thermodynamically you may have corrosion active, your corrosion rate may not be significant enough to really affect the overall longevity of the structure if you don't promote that reduction reaction. So this where it becomes kind of complicated for the carbonation process, because in order for the gases to penetrate into the concrete, it really prefers drier environments. So the drier the concrete is and drier environment you have, the more likely chance you have for that CO2 or even oxygen to penetrate through the concrete to get to the steel surface to promote these reactions. But if you don't have enough moisture, you cannot couple the anodic and cathodic reaction system. So really it's these wetting and drying cycles that really are aggressors in terms of how corrosion can develop at rates that can be detrimental to the service life of our structures. So in dry periods, for example, you can have fast diffusion of CO2 and oxygen, but in wet cycles, you allow that coupling of those electrochemical reactions to occur to promote that loss of metal systems. If you were to have relative humidity probably around 55 to 75%, you would tend to have faster carbonation rates through the concrete. But again, we mentioned that for the corrosion rates to occur, really you need that coupling, you need that moisture there. So in the picture on the right-hand side shows something interesting, to me at least. This is a picture of or side of a core hole taken from one of our large bridges in Florida, and looking at a bridge that was one of the first to use high performance concrete. And so a chip was taken off the side of the core hole, for example, and a pH indicator spray was used to indicate where carbonation is occurring or not occurring. So the phenolphthalein solution will spray into the surface, and when you see purple in the drawing, you see where it's not carbonated, as to be expected with this good quality concrete. But you also notice that we had this hairline crack. Well, it's maybe a little thicker than hairline, but this fairly thin crack that occurred on the concrete surface. And you notice that the phenolphthalein didn't color that purple. So we have this thin interface that's carbonated. So essentially CO2 is able to penetrate even through this high performance concrete, carbonate a thin layer. In this particular system, the crack penetrated fairly deeply and all the way to the interface with the steel rebar. So there can be a lens for which that rebar sees an environment that has carbonate concrete that's associated with a lower pH where active corrosion can occur. So even with high performance concrete, there can be some concerns for carbonation that may appear. And again, we'll allude a little bit to UHPC and how that may be beneficial to mitigate some of these effects. One important thing to mention for this type of corrosion, that the degradation can vary greatly. It is dependent on the material that you use, the design detail provisions of the rebar placement, depends on the environment, the cycling of the environmental conditions. Many different things affect these things. So often it's very difficult to get a firm grasp on service life. And so piggybacking off some of the work that Fatima mentioned, especially the second project looking at the retrofit system, at FIU, we did some experiments with those very specimens to identify the effect of carbonation, how they can occur, and also with the retrofit. We are have long-term exposure, the very test columns that are out in our boneyard, where we allow the corrosion to continue and continuing work looking at some of the possibly beneficial effect of having that UHPC retrofit in terms of existing corrosion that may occur. So here are a couple pictures of those samples, and I know Fatima presented a little bit on those already. So those are the columns that were cast with the initial normal strength concrete in interior, a fairly benign concrete. The idea is that this type of concrete probably have more damage than a higher performance concrete, and it may need retrofit. The bottom left-hand corner shows some of the sensors that we fabricated and designed here in FIU and implemented on these test specimens to identify corrosion development, and some of the material testing that went along with part of this research program. So some more pictures of the test specimens during testing. So the substrate concrete was a class 2 concrete with a compressive strength about 3.4 KSI. And we place those corrosion probes. We put 2 per column. One we had as a control where it wasn't carbonated, and the other one where we developed a method in university to accelerate that corrosion to, we don't have to wait 50 years essentially to get some results. And so we subjected those columns to accelerated carbonation. We had a greater than 99.9% pure CO2. We pressurized a vessel to around 50 psi and for one set, and 20 psi a little bit slower for another one, to try to force that corrosion to measure the development of corrosion. The bread and butter for us really is the open circuit potential, the Hassel potential, some people call it, and also to look at the polarization resistance relating to the corrosion rate. So before we pressurize the carbonation pressure vessel, we establish our baseline just to make sure they're not corroding up front. So for all of our columns and all our sensors, with our testing, we measure corrosion rate using linear polarization resistance method. And this table here, you can see some of the results we have. Polarization resistance is inversely related to the corrosion rate. And knowing that the surface area of the steel probes that we have, we can calculate the corrosion current density for each one of our samples. And notably, they're very, very small. As we indicated, again, steel loves to be in concrete. Is a very beneficial environment where really it should be durable until bad things happen, including having long-term presence of carbon dioxide in the system. So the big thing about this really, we're checking our sanity, identifying the initial cases that they weren't corroding, and then we pressurize the vessel. So the top right-hand picture shows that very method that we developed here in FIU. We had a pressure vessel, just some flanges, and some connecting pipe components connected to the CO2 tank. We pressurized different values, fitted onto the surface of the concrete, directly above where those corrosion sensors are located. And we measure hot cell potentials, and we also use our phenolphthalein spray. So I'll talk a little bit more about those colorful pictures we have in the bottom. So essentially, the oblong circles or the more elliptical shape you have in the middle is essentially the interior portion of that pressure vessel, and where the flange is connected essentially. And after the accelerated carbonation, we remove the system, and we spray with that phenolphthalein pH indicator on the surface. Pink is showing where it's not carbonated, and that the not pink color essentially where it is carbonated. And so we're fairly happy with how effective that technique was to choose a localized location of carbonation. So the arrows are pointing to that center part in the middle of that pressure vessel where the concrete was carbonated. So we verified as well for the embedded reinforcing steel, the longitudinal steel that was placed for the retrofit purpose for the project that Fatima mentioned before. We use those bars to measure the half cell potentials embedded underneath, and what those contour plots are on the left-hand side of this figure, of the slide. So essentially, where you see the circular contours is where we're having more electronegative potentials. And I apologize, I just realized I don't have to scale for you here, but those circular contours is where we have our more negative potentials, indicative of active corrosion. And around that contour, outside where that vessel was placed, we're having the more electropositive potentials, indicating where the steel remained passive. So we were pleased that we're able to, in a in a very short amount of time be able to reproduce this amount of carbonation corrosion to the bars underneath. And then we measured the corrosion rate, the half cell potential, the corrosion rate beforehand, again, before the carbonation process, just to verify that indeed is passive. So the corrosion potentials are fairly electropositive, more electropositive in this case here, more positive than about minus 150 millivolts versus the copper sulfate electrode for those of you keeping track. And the corrosion current density, again, very, very low, shown in the graph on the right. But then what happened when we introduced that pressure vessel? So that shows that shift when carbonation occurred. So these two graph shows that the red arrow shows initially the time when it carbonated. And so we placed the pressure vessel with the CO2 gas, it diffused through the system for the first 20 minutes or so. It got to a point where it became sufficient enough where it activated the steel directly underneath that pressure vessel. We know active corrosion developed because we have that drop in half cell potentials from more positive to highly negative potential, about more negative than about minus 300 millivolt versus copper sulfate electrode, and the rapid increase in the corrosion current density. So this is how we verified that corrosion indeed developed underneath that system. Notably, the second vertical line, the stripe that you see in the curve, represents when we release that gas, when we shut off the valve. And we noticed something, that there was a little bit of recovery shown by the green arrow. So where we had a fairly electropositive potential before carbonation, upon carbonating it, corrosion develops have a much more negative potential, and then it recovered after the CO2 was removed. So this is indicative for us that there's some type of recovery of oxygen coming to the system. So I'll remind the audience that the interior concrete was a low quality concrete. The compressive strength was about, what was it, 3,400 psi or so. And it seems like some of the residual oxygen that was displaced by the CO2 gas outside was able to move back in or diffuse back into the local area. So for retrofit, this is something that we're keeping track of and keeping consideration for design purposes of the residual amount of oxygen that is present in the system, especially when you have a shell type of retrofit, how it may come into play in terms of the long-term durability of the rebar underneath. So that was an interesting finding that we're continuing to explore further. Here's an example of similar concrete, just to identify the rates at which carbonation can occur. So these are all samples of concrete kept in either a desiccated environment or a controlled environment at 75% relative humidity. And you can see when placed into these carbonation environmental chambers by the color indicators that in a very short amount of time that carbon dioxide gas can penetrate very, very quickly. And that's indicated by the loss of the purple colors over time. With the higher humidities at 75%, we still could carbonate the concrete fairly readily, but it took more time. So in a dry environment, it took about 67 hours to fully carbonate the concrete cylinder. With a 75% humidity, it took us about a month. We also placed samples at 85% humidity and soaked in high humidity. In the time period that we were working with these, they did not carbonate because carbonation front moves very, very slowly through wet concrete, through the water in the concrete pore water. So how can UHPC be beneficial to us for these type of problems? So here's results that was conducted at FIU a handful of years ago, but very pertinent, just exploring some of the generic characteristics of UHPC, and one is the electrical resistivity of concrete. So even for conventional concrete, we use this as a means to identify quality of the concrete and conditions where corrosion may occur. So resistivity is related to permeability. It also relates to possible coupling of these anodes and cathodes that is required for corrosion to occur. So in the peach and maroon colors, that's for a conventional concrete. You notice the resistivity is much lower than those of the blue and the purple UHPC materials. So evidently we know UHPC is a very high quality material, has a high resistivity. High resistivity relates to low permeability, and also less a coupling of those electrodes required for the corrosion process. Also notably, we see from the conventional concrete is also dependent on moisture. So when you have dry environments, you will have a much higher resistivity, but still fairly low. When it's wetter, the resistivity will be smaller. But in the case of UHPC, whether we kept it in ambient condition at 75% humidity or we soaked them, there wasn't really effect because UHPC is such a dense material. So the moisture never really had opportunity to enter into the concrete pore network. So even with very wet environments, it still retained very high resistance and resistivity. Beneficial again because prolongs the time it takes for any aggressive ions to move. It causes a less effective coupling of a system, and also is probably related to possible gas movement in the system as well. I'll mention some of my colleagues at FIU who helped with some of this work. Here's some results for the rapid chloride permeability test with migration test, looking at some of the UHPC mixes that are being developed and used here in FIU. And typically, so the first row will be for normal strength concrete. A very high amount of Coulomb charge passes through the system, so the rating is high. Evidently, ions can pass through this electric field very quickly. And compared to that for our UHPC material, the amount of Coulomb charge passed is much smaller, in some cases considered negligible or very low, verifying again that UHPC is a very dense material and allows for slow penetration of aggressive ionic species that can cause corrosion to occur. Some other testing we did to look more specifically at gases, in particular oxygen. We looked at oxygen diffusivity in terms of electrochemical technique. I don't want to belabor too much on the technique itself, but we were able to identify through current that develops in the corrosion process the extent to which oxygen can develop. And so we identified this oxygen diffusivity, we call it, comparing our conventional concrete in the graph, in the bottom left graph. The 3 on the left represents the normal strength concrete at different moisture conditions, and the 3 on the right are for UHPC for different moisture conditions. And invariably, the UHPC, whether it's in a dry environment or wet environment, has much lower oxygen transport of oxygen through the concrete compared to that of a conventional concrete. So this is good verification, again, verifying that the concrete has low permeability, but also the gases have a more difficult time to penetrate this material, whether it be oxygen, and similarly, it can be alluded to CO2 as well. So UHPC can be a useful material to prolong the time for which CO2 can penetrate through the system. Looking more in terms of retrofit and using UHPC in a mixed environment, this mixed with normal strength concrete and with for repair applications essentially. Some testing was done at FIU to look at the extent to which what we call macrocell coupling can develop. So what does that mean? There are many cases in piles and columns for bridge work where we have damage that occurred even after a retrofit develops. And part of this has to do with what we call a halo effect, and also representative of what we call macrocell corrosion. You have steel that's embedded in the new material, and you have some rebar that's still embedded in the substrate material, then invariably will have some amount of chlorides that remains in the system. So we look at the effect of coupling this steel embedded in different environments and see if it can be adverse, and if UHPC repair work can be any different or better, for example. So of course the caveat is what is the extent of the repair, but it really depends on the project. So sometimes repair may be localized, sometimes the repair can be much more. The repair may be a jacket of the whole entire column, for example, covering a greater surface. So here's a schematic of the test prism. Some of the bars are in the contaminated substrate concrete, and some are in repaired UHPC or normal strength repair materials. So I'll try to go a little more quicker. This graph shows the current that develops when we have normal strength concrete repair material compared to the UHPC repair material. Both graphs represent the rate of which corrosion can occur. So we have our substrate environment having different amounts of chlorides. And so for our normal strength concrete, when we initially have low level chlorides, the rates are very small because no chlorides are there. With high chlorides, the rates are significant. Upon wetting the sample, everybody jumps up, the corrosion rate can be significant with the normal strength concrete repair. On the other hand, when we have the UHPC repair in these scenarios, that our low corrosion rates, even after wetting, remains low. And interestingly, even when the substrate has fairly adverse and high level of chlorides in the system. So this became interesting to us as well as UHPC being of interest in retrofit for some of the more adverse damage for marine systems or a chloride contaminated system. Even carbonation can be partly alluded to as well. Of course, the caveat is it depends on the size of the repair and with the placement of different rebar and oxygen availability. But some promising results shows beneficial effect with the UHPC. Also, our colleagues also did some more work, not necessarily related to corrosion, but concrete durability. With the UHPC developed and used here at FIU for many of our projects, we're looking at the freeze thaw frost resistance of our material, and we have here the freeze thaw chamber, and looking at some of the testing afterwards to identify the material itself afterwards and its degradation. And so this graph shows the dynamic modular elasticity after several cycles with the various designs of UHPC being used at the university. So the normal strength concrete is just not there. That green line you see, it was damaged very quickly. We'll admit that air entrainment wasn't placed on those particular samples, but they were just used as reference for UHPC, and the UHPC for the most part largely shows excellent behavior in terms of frost attack, largely because there's not a lot of water available in the interior of the concrete to cause that cyclic freezing expansion, for example, internally. So with the last few minutes I have, I wanted to present some of the work that Dr. Adaraziz Amini was working on, and I think is a good case study to represent the good use for UHPC for different designs, including for high rises, in this case a 42-story building, using UHPC for columns, which is the theme of today's presentation. So this is the work that Dr. Aziz Amini had looked at. Again, I thought it was a very very good case study to represent, just again showing the good effect of how UHPC may be applied for many different cases. And so in this particular case design study, it's developing a building, 42-story, 4 meters high, about 168 meters high. Here are some of the initial floor plans of what it may look like. And so the work was looking at the various columns that can be developed. And so I'll cover these materials real quick. Evidently, UHPC is a strong material, which means for the same type of loading and the stress and strength that you may encounter, you should be able to use less material. So you have stronger and thinner and more slender elements that should be able to carry the loads that you have for these designs. Importantly, this example show that UHPC taking advantage of its mechanical behavior, that you may be able to adjust your form work in your designs to do things faster or even open up floor spaces. So we'll talk about the columns a little bit more, that you can reduce the floor plan essentially using the UHPC. So this slide shows the example design for this building, and so they have the different floors with the different column sizes using a high strength concrete. You can see here in the red box on the left hand side, those are the design column sizes next to with the concrete with the various F'(C) next to it. And you can compare that using ultra high performance concrete. So again, notice the stresses that develop from the loading for the nominal area of the columns used, and comparing that to UHPC. So the benefit is that you can have uniform, this example demonstrates that you can use uniform size columns along the whole entire height of the building. So you reduce form work, you can speed up construction, importantly, you can save some floor space underneath, and show good use on how UHPC can be used even for these vertical construction of our system. So with that, I would like to pass the presentation back to Fatime, who will conclude our presentation.
Okay, there are some important advantages of UHPC for columns that should be mentioned at the end of this presentation. Research on the use of UHPC for columns indicated that good structural performance with axial and lateral loading can be obtained with appropriate steel fiber content. FIU research is investigating the possibility of reducing steel fiber content to improve the cost effectiveness of UHPC applications in columns. For the retrofit, UHPC shell can increase the stiffness, strength, and energy absorption of the columns compared to the normal strength concrete jacketing. UHPC was shown to have excellent durability characteristics, including corrosion and other environmental factors that result in a longer service life. FIU research is investigating several novel retrofit techniques. Ongoing research is focused on validating the novel application of UHPC as a practical construction material that can promote the service life while enhancing the cost effectiveness. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks to today's presenters for your interesting and informative presentation. Bijan and Paul will now moderate the Q&A session. Paul?
Okay, thank you, Frey. Really interesting. We do have some questions. Some of them came in beforehand, and we have some that came in during your presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the questions. The first one we have here is, do you have any experience or can point to any professional publications related to strengthening existing bridge pier columns?
Yeah, research work by FIU is in progress, and the result will publish soon.
Okay, and that was mostly your second part of your presentation, I guess. That was in retrofit.
Both first project and second, right?
Okay, all right. The next one, you covered this a little bit. It says, did the reduction in fiber content influence the mode of failure, such as transitioning from ductile to more brittle behavior?
Right. Yeah. The 2%, the column with 2% steel fiber had more ductile behavior, and we had a less stiffness and strength reduction with the specimen with more steel fiber.
Okay. The next one, specifications about the mix designs of the used mixtures in bridges. There were, do you have any specifications for the proposed mix designs to be used for steel bridges?
For the mix design, we use open source UHPC mix that can be found on ABC UTC website.
Okay. That's good. And the next one we have, the first part of it is, are there any projects that have used UHPC in projects worldwide? Or excuse me, in projects?
Yeah, there are too many projects at Europe. Regarding the research project, we had some projects that can be found on the ABC UTC website.
Okay, we had a couple questions on cost. And the first one was, what is the cost of the UHPC columns?
I think there is no specific cost depending on production you want. It differs.
Okay. Now, on y'all's project, you used your own UHPC. It wasn't a proprietary. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That usually affects the cost somewhat.
Yeah.
Okay. The next one we have is, can this be used in all concrete construction?
Yes, depending on the application you are looking for. For example, for more strands, for more ductility, you can use UHPC in concrete applications.
Okay. Can you comment on the UHPC columns in marine environments?
Okay, in marine environments, well, we put part of the presentation talking about some of them, the environmental conditions. So in marine environments, I guess one of the issues can be how corrosion can be a problem with it. And so UHPC seems to have good application for those environments because of the high quality material and low permeability. It looks like it can alleviate many of the problems we have for our conventional concrete. I'll mention too that one of the slides we show that there's cracking of the concrete that develops. And so with the additional tensile capacity of UHPC, ideally it can alleviate a lot of the concerns of chloride penetration, carbonation to cracks if we just minimize the amount of cracks can develop to begin with. But for marine environments, yeah, it seems that UHPC can be quite a viable option to increase service life and also provide the additional strength requirements.
The next question we have here is, how does reducing steel fiber content affect the crack bridging ability and post-cracking behavior in UHPC columns?
Steel fiber content can have effect on tensile behavior, tensile strength. That's why it can affect the crack pattern, damage modes.
Okay. We had another question that came in is, what is the performance of UHPC columns in seismically active regions?
Actually, more detail about seismic applications need to be reviewed, and we will publish the result. Right now, I cannot share more detail about that.
We had a question that came in during the presentation. It says, Could you explain some of the process to get the hysteretic response for moment curvature and compression? Is that a standardized test, or is it something y'all developed?
Yeah, we recorded the displacement at the top of the column and then plot the data. The displacement was the displacement on the cap, the top of the bottom of the column, and we had the applied load. We plot the displacement versus applied load and the hysteresis response. We achieved the hysteresis response.
Okay. When you plot up that hysteretic response, when do you stop the test? How many cycles do you run it?
Oh, we ran the test up to 7 inches for almost all the specimens.
Okay. But then do you stop it when it finally just comes apart? Is that?
Yeah,
Okay.
right, yeah.
Okay. All right. We got another question here. When using the UHPC shell, you talked about a reduction in the plastic hinge length, but how about the horizontal stiffness of the column itself? What would be the intensity of the stiffness increase when adding UHPC shells to reinforced concrete columns? You have any idea on that?
Yeah, the stiffness increased. The effect of UHPC actually was that the reduction of the stiffness. It helped delaying the reduction of the stiffness. You could see, if I can share the screen. Yes, here you can see, for example, for 2% steel fiber, the initial stiffness is more than the specimen without a steel fiber, and we can compare it with the specimen without any jacket, but I didn't plot it here.
Okay.
Thank you again for today's presenter for sharing your IBT, ABC, UTC research work and for your thoughtful responses during the Q&A session. Thanks also to Bijan and Paul for moderating the Q&A session, and to all participants for your interest, attendance, and questions. This concludes today's seminar. Thank you.